Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Mark Reynolds was 42 and had a solid career as a civil engineer when he met Claire at a sustainable architecture conference. She was 29 at the time, working as a project analyst for a mid-sized firm, and there was something about her that instantly drew him in. It wasn't obvious beauty, though she was attractive, but the way she gestured when talking about energy efficiency, how her eyes lit up when she discussed innovative solutions, how utterly passionate she seemed about her work. Mark, a man of few words and plenty of actions, felt something rare in that moment, the certainty that he'd found someone worth getting to know deeply. Their dating lasted 2 years. Mark wasn't the romantic type who bought flowers for no reason or planned elaborate dinners. His love showed up in quieter ways, showing up at her office with coffee when he knew she'd have a tough day, memorizing the names of all her co-workers to ask about them in conversation, waking up earlier on weekends to make the breakfast she loved. Claire, in turn, seemed to value that consistency. She said she felt safe with him, that after years of turbulent relationships with unpredictable men, Mark's stability was exactly what she needed. They married in a simple ceremony with fewer than 50 guests, held in a botanical garden on the edge of town. Mark remembered every detail of that day: her dress, simple and elegant, the nervous smile she gave when he stumbled slightly over his vows, the tight hug she gave him when the judge declared them husband and wife. He promised himself right then that he'd be the husband she deserved, that he'd build a life with her as solid as the structures he designed professionally. The first few years were exactly as he'd imagined. They bought a house in a quiet Charlotte, North Carolina suburb, a 1990s build that Mark meticulously renovated on weekends. Claire advanced in her career while he kept the home running smoothly. They didn't have kids yet, though they occasionally talked about it. Claire always said she wanted to wait until she felt professionally settled, until she was sure she could balance motherhood and her career. Mark patiently agreed, trusting her timing. After all, they had time. They were building something together, brick by brick, and he saw no reason to rush the process. Their routine was comfortable in its predictability. Mark woke at 5:30, made coffee, left a mug on her nightstand before heading to work. He got home around 6, usually finding Claire already there or arriving shortly after. They ate dinner together, talked about their days, watched a show or read in quiet companionship. On weekends, he handled the house and yard while she caught up on work or went out with friends. It wasn't an exciting life, Mark admitted, but it was a good one. Solid. Built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. When Claire turned 38, came the news she'd been waiting years for: her promotion to project coordinator. Mark planned a special dinner to celebrate, reserving a table at her favorite Italian restaurant and buying a bottle of wine she'd mentioned wanting to try months earlier. She was genuinely moved by the gesture, and he felt satisfied for having paid attention to the details. The promotion meant more responsibilities, Claire explained that night, including monthly trips to train regional teams in other cities. The company had a safety policy requiring employees to travel in pairs, especially to distant locations. She'd be paired with Daniel Carter, an account manager who'd been with the company for years. Mark nodded, asked about logistics, how they'd adjust their home routine. Not once did he feel jealous or worried. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, and he trusted Claire completely. The trip started the next month. Claire usually left on Tuesdays and returned on Thursdays or Fridays. She called every night to tell him about the trainings, the teams she met, the challenges at each branch. She mentioned Daniel occasionally, always in a professional context, that he was funny and made meetings less boring, that he had 2 young kids and constantly showed photos of them, that he was competent at his job and helped her presentations go smoothly. Mark listened closely, asked appropriate questions, felt connected to her professional life even from afar. When she came back from trips, he always had the house spotless, dinner ready or a reservation made, and arms open to welcome her. Claire seemed tired sometimes, but he attributed that to the natural stress of a new role. In the months that followed, Mark didn't notice anything particularly different. Maybe Claire was a little more distant occasionally, a little quieter after certain trips, but he rationalized it as professional exhaustion. She was under pressure, proving her worth in the new position, dealing with high expectations. It was natural that she'd be mentally drained. He tried to compensate by being even more present, even more supportive, even more the steady husband she'd always said she appreciated. The Saturday that changed everything started like any other. Mark woke at 7, later than on weekdays, and made a full breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit. Claire came down around 8, hair still damp from her shower, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt. They had coffee together, talking about weekend plans. She mentioned wanting to go to the bookstore later, maybe dinner out that night. Mark agreed to everything, pleased at the prospect of a quiet weekend. After coffee, he checked work emails at the living room table while Claire settled on the sofa with a book. The house was quiet except for the occasional page turn and the distant sound of a lawnmower from next door. It was a perfectly ordinary domestic scene, the kind of moment Mark deeply cherished. When his phone rang, he didn't look at the caller ID before answering. Probably a coworker with an urgent issue, or maybe his mom calling for her weekly Sunday lunch invite. The woman's voice on the other end was unfamiliar, formal, controlled in a way that suggested conscious effort. Mark Reynolds? He confirmed, noticing out of the corner of his eye that Claire had looked up from her book, naturally curious about who was calling. My name is Rachel Carter. I'm Daniel Carter's wife, the one your wife works with. Mark felt something strange in his stomach, a sensation he couldn't immediately name. Why would the wife of Claire's coworker be calling him on a Saturday? Yes, Mrs. Carter. How can I help you? There was a pause on the other end, as if Rachel was gathering courage. When she spoke again, each word seemed measured, heavy. Mr. Reynolds, there's no easy way to say this, so I'll be direct. My husband confessed to me last night that last week, during the business trip to Atlanta, he and your wife had an affair. The world seemed to stop spinning. Mark froze completely, phone pressed to his ear, eyes fixed on an undefined spot on the wall. His mind, trained to process complex information and find logical solutions, simply locked up. Rachel's words echoed in his head, but he couldn't make them mean what they obviously meant. Rachel continued, apparently interpreting his silence as a need for more details. Daniel is devastated with guilt. He couldn't sleep, couldn't look me in the eyes. When he finally confessed, it was like a weight lifted off his shoulders. I've decided I'm going to try to forgive him. We have 2 kids, a life built together, and I believe he's genuinely sorry. But I thought you deserved to know the truth about your wife. You deserve the same choice I had, to decide what to do with complete information. Mark swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as paper. I understand, he managed to say, his voice sounding strangely calm, even to him. Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Carter. I'm so sorry, Mr. Reynolds. Truly sorry. No one deserves to find out something like this. She hung up. Mark slowly lowered the phone, as if it were made of glass and might shatter with any sudden movement. Claire was still on the sofa, book abandoned in her lap, watching him with an expression he now recognized as cautious. Maybe even nervous. Who was that, honey? Her voice sounded perfectly normal, maybe artificially so. Mark looked at her. Really looked, as if seeing her for the first time in years. The brown eyes he loved so much, the face he kissed every morning, the hands he held during movies. How had those same hands touched another man just a week ago? He took a deep breath, gathering every fragment of control he had. It was Daniel's wife. Rachel Carter. He watched her reaction closely, the slight widening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible stiffening of her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the book. Signs he would have ignored an hour ago, but now screamed guilt. Rachel? Why would she call you? Claire tried to sound confused, but there was something forced in the question. She told me Daniel confessed to her last night. Confessed that you two had an affair last week in Atlanta. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Claire went completely still for 3 full seconds. Then her face twisted into an expression of outrage that Mark instantly recognized as fake. What? That's absolutely ridiculous. Daniel must be having some kind of breakdown, or maybe their marriage is falling apart and he made this up to. I don't know, to have an excuse. She stood up, gestures frantic. Mark, you've known me for 13 years. You know I could never do something like this. Mark stayed seated, watching her with eyes that had changed. There was no anger in them yet, just an analytical coldness he used at work when evaluating potentially compromised structures. Claire, he confessed to his own wife. He destroyed his marriage with that confession. What reason would Daniel have to invent something like this? I don't know. People do irrational things under pressure. Maybe he's having mental health issues, or, Rachel said he gave details, Mark interrupted calmly. Last week. Atlanta. Marriott downtown. The exact same days you were there for the training. Claire began pacing back and forth, hands gesturing frantically. He could have made up the details. People who lie create convincing stories, everyone knows that. Mark, for God's sake, you have to believe me. I'm your wife. Exactly, he said, and the word carried a weight that made her stop. You're my wife. And Daniel has been married to Rachel for 9 years, has 2 children with her. Why would a man destroy all that with a lie? Why would he confess to something that didn't happen? Claire's facade began to crack. Mark could see it happening in real time, like a dam giving way under too much pressure. Her eyes filled with tears, her lower lip trembled, the hands that had gestured with such confidence seconds ago now visibly shook. Mark, please, you have to understand. I never meant to. Did it happen or not, Claire? The question was direct, with no room for evasion. Yes or no? She broke. Literally broke, knees giving way as she sank back onto the sofa, sobs bursting from her chest as if they'd been held back for days. Tears streamed down the face Mark had loved so much, the face that now looked like it belonged to a stranger. It was just once, she choked between sobs. Just one time, Mark. I swear on everything sacred, it was just once. He didn't respond, just waited for her to go on, his silence more devastating than any shout. We were at the hotel bar after the last day of training. The Atlanta team had left, just the 2 of us left. We ordered wine to unwind, started talking about pressure, about feeling like you're never enough, about expectations that seem impossible to meet. Daniel talked about how invisible he felt at home, how his wife only saw his flaws. I vented about the fear of always disappointing someone, whether it was you, or the company, or myself. She sniffled, trying to control her sobs. 1 bottle turned into 2. The conversations got more intimate. He touched my hand, and Mark, I was vulnerable, exhausted, and he was there, listening, seeming to understand. We went up to his room. And it happened. Mark felt something break inside him. Not exactly his heart, though that too. Something more fundamental, the image he'd held of their marriage, of the woman he shared his life with, of himself as someone who knew his wife. All of it shattered like glass hit by a stone. I regretted it the second after, Claire continued, words pouring out now. Literally the second after. I left his room before sunrise, went back to my room, and cried in the shower for an hour. On the flight back, we couldn't even look at each other. Daniel requested a transfer to another division the next week. We agreed it was a terrible mistake, that it should never have happened, that we'd bury it and move on. I was going to tell you, Mark, I swear I was. But when I got home and you were there with dinner ready and that look on your face, I couldn't. I thought if I forgot, if I pretended it never happened, eventually it would be like it never did. Mark stood up slowly. His movements were controlled, precise, almost mechanical. Claire watched him with pleading eyes, clearly expecting, what? Forgiveness? Understanding? Some sign that they could get past this? "Where are you going?" she asked as he walked toward the hallway. "I'm packing a bag," he replied without turning. "No. Wait. You're packing a bag? You're leaving?" "No, Claire. You're leaving. You have until noon tomorrow to find somewhere else to stay. I don't want you in this house." The statement hit her like a slap. "Mark, no. Please, we can talk about this. One mistake can't erase 13 years. We can do couples therapy, we can." He finally turned, and what she saw in his face made her fall silent. It wasn't anger, not hatred. It was worse, cold, calculated indifference. "You had a week to tell me. You chose to lie. You chose to let me find out from the wife of the man you slept with. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are." He walked upstairs without looking back, leaving Claire sobbing on the sofa they'd decorated together. Mark spent the rest of that Saturday on autopilot. He called his lawyer, a college friend who specialized in family law. He explained the situation with the same objectivity he'd used to describe a structural flaw in a project. The lawyer, Greg, was professional and empathetic, explaining that in North Carolina, infidelity could impact asset division and alimony, especially with documented confession. Mark took mental notes, processing legal details while compartmentalizing the pain threatening to consume him. Claire tried to talk to him several times that day. He ignored her completely, focused on organizing paperwork, checking joint accounts, listing assets. She cried, begged, even screamed at one point, accusing him of being cold and incapable of forgiveness. Mark didn't respond. Words, he'd learned, were insignificant compared to actions. And her actions had spoken loud enough. At noon on Sunday, as he'd determined, Claire stood at the door with 2 suitcases. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her face pale and worn. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in 24 hours. "Mark, please, reconsider. We can get past this. Marriages survive worse things." He was sitting in the living room, laptop open, already filling out divorce forms Greg had sent. He looked up briefly. "Some marriages survive. Ours won't. The lawyer will contact you on Monday. You're not even willing to try?" Her voice was small, defeated. "Did you try, Claire? When you were in that hotel room with Daniel, did you think about trying to save our marriage?" She had no answer to that. She left without another word, and Mark heard her car pull away, taking 13 years of memories that now felt contaminated. The divorce process was surprisingly fast. Claire, consumed by guilt and apparently without energy to fight, accepted Greg's terms almost without contest. Mark would keep the house, which was mostly in his name anyway. Accounts would be divided proportionally, with Mark receiving a larger share due to the documented infidelity. Claire didn't ask for alimony, perhaps recognizing she had no moral right to financial support from the man she'd betrayed. In 4 months, it was finalized. 13 years of marriage dissolved in 120 days of paperwork and signatures. Mark sold the house 2 months later. He couldn't sleep in the room he'd shared with her, couldn't drink coffee in the kitchen where she'd confessed, couldn't exist in spaces saturated with memories now corrupted. He bought a modern downtown apartment, furnished it with new pieces, created an environment that carried no history. Some mutual friends tried to intervene, suggesting he was being too harsh, that people make mistakes. Mark listened politely, then cut contact. He didn't need people in his life who minimized betrayal as just a mistake. A mistake was forgetting a birthday. Sleeping with another man was a conscious choice, multiple choices, really, each leading to the next until the final act. Claire, he learned through unavoidable acquaintances, had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. She stayed at the same job but requested not to travel anymore. Apparently, Daniel had indeed been transferred to an office in another city, taking his family with him. Rachel, true to her word, had forgiven her husband, and they were trying to rebuild their marriage. Mark felt nothing about it, no satisfaction, no resentment. Their lives were no longer his concern. He focused on work with renewed intensity, taking on increasingly complex projects, earning recognition at the company. Colleagues commented on his dedication, unaware it was a survival mechanism. While his mind was occupied calculating stresses and designing foundations, there was no space to think about Claire, about betrayal, about how he hadn't seen the signs. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, 18 months after the divorce, that Mark met Lena. He was at the public library, researching building codes for a specific project, when he saw her in the adjacent section. She had brown hair pulled into a messy bun, reading glasses that constantly slipped down her nose, and was surrounded by an impressive stack of books on landscape architecture. Something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way she read, completely absorbed, gently biting her lower lip in concentration. Maybe it was how she occasionally smiled to herself when she found an interesting passage. Or maybe it was simply that, for the first time in a year and a half, Mark felt curiosity about another person. He didn't approach her that day. Nor the next, when he coincidentally found her in the same spot. The third time, she looked up and smiled at him, recognizing him as the man who always sat at the nearby table. "Heavy research?" she asked, gesturing to the papers spread before him. "Building codes," he replied. "Glamorous, I know." She laughed, a genuine sound that warmed something inside him that had been cold for a long time. "I'm researching sustainable gardens." "Just as glamorous." They started talking. Lena was a landscape architect, divorced 3 years ago, no children. Her ex-husband had been a workaholic who prioritized career over marriage until there was no marriage left to prioritize. She didn't blame him exactly, she explained, people just grow in different directions sometimes. Mark appreciated her emotional maturity, the absence of bitterness. They began meeting regularly at the library, then at cafes, then for dinners. Mark was honest about his divorce, about Claire's betrayal, about his difficulty trusting again. Lena listened without judgment, offering balanced perspective. "Broken trust is a serious wound," she said one night, as they shared a bottle of wine in his apartment. "But wounds heal, Mark. Not always completely, they leave scars. But scars are just reminders that we survived." He thought about that for weeks. With Lena, he felt something he hadn't felt with Claire in the last years of their marriage, lightness. She didn't demand he be the perfect husband, the unshakable provider, the emotional rock. She simply wanted him to be Mark, with all his flaws and complications. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began falling in love with that unconditional acceptance. They married 2 years after meeting, a ceremony even smaller than Mark's first, just immediate family and closest friends. Lena wore a light blue dress, saying white was for first marriages and she preferred color anyway. Mark thought it was perfectly fitting. A year after the wedding, Lena announced she was pregnant. Mark, at 46, would be a father for the first time. The initial fear, that he was too old, that he didn't know how to be a dad, was quickly replaced by cautious joy. When Nathan was born, Mark felt a love of intensity he hadn't known he was capable of. Holding his son for the first time, watching the baby's eyes open to the world, Mark understood that everything had been worth it. The pain of Claire's betrayal, the months of loneliness, the slow rebuilding of his ability to trust, all of it had led him to this exact moment. 3 years after Nathan's birth, on a Sunday afternoon at the park, Mark was pushing his son on a swing when he saw her. Claire was across the playground, sitting on a bench, watching the children play. She was alone, no child to watch, just sitting there by herself. Mark barely recognized her at first. She seemed diminished somehow, thinner than he remembered, hair lacking its former shine, clothes that looked chosen without care. Deep shadows hung under her eyes, and a weary quality in her posture told a story of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. She saw him at the same moment. Her eyes widened in recognition, then filled with something Mark identified as pain mixed with regret. For long seconds, they simply looked at each other across the distance of the playground, years of history compressed into that silent moment. Mark gave a brief nod, a polite gesture devoid of warmth. She nodded back, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Nathan demanded attention then, asking to go higher on the swing, and Mark turned his focus back to his son. When he looked again at the bench, Claire was gone. Lena appeared minutes later with ice cream, smiling as she saw Mark and Nathan laughing together. She sat on the nearby bench, offering him his favorite flavor. "You okay?" she asked, noticing something in his expression. Mark looked at her, at his son, at the life he'd built on the ruins of the previous one. "Perfect," he replied, and for the first time in a long time, he truly meant it. That night, after putting Nathan to bed, Mark and Lena sat on the porch with wine and comfortable silence. She read a book on Japanese gardens while he watched the stars. "I saw my ex-wife today," he said eventually, breaking the silence. Lena lowered her book, her expression open and non-judgmental. "At the park." She was alone. She looked sad. "How did you feel?" Mark considered the question seriously. How did he feel? There was no satisfaction in seeing Claire suffer, no vengeful pleasure he might have expected to feel years ago. Nor was there pain, not anymore. What he felt was something closer to compassionate indifference. She'd made choices, those choices had consequences, and he was no longer responsible for any part of it. "I felt she's living with the consequences of her choices," he finally replied. "And I felt grateful. Because her choices, however painful at the time, brought me here. To you. To Nathan. To this life that's better than anything I had before." Lena smiled, that gentle smile that always calmed him. Scars as reminders of survival? Exactly. She returned to her book and he returned to the stars, and the silence between them was filled not with unspoken words or buried resentments, but with genuine peace. Mark had built a new life, a solid structure on foundations of honesty and true love. And this time, he knew, there would be no cracks. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.